Hello from Nairobi, Kenya, and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining this Global Investigative Journalism Network webinar, which is about fundraising for investigative journalism in Africa. My name is Fiona Nzingo. I'm the Membership and Engagement Manager at the Global Forum for Media Development, which is known as GFMD. GFMD is the largest global community for media development, media freedom, and journalism support. And through our collaboration, coordination, and collective action, our network of 191 members and counting in over 75 countries, as well as dozens of partners, we aim to create, promote, and deliver policies and programs to sustain journalism as a public good. As you've probably figured out from my role and the organization I work for, the topic for today's GIJN webinar is very close to my heart. Journalism watchdog's role is more critical than ever before, and for sure we all want good journalism to thrive. However, to do so, media organizations, whether they're profit-making or otherwise, they need all the money they can get to attract and retain top talent, as well as finance their operations. In Africa, despite the funding and sustainability challenges that watchdog reporting faces today, journalists across Africa are producing top-tier investigative stories. This is evident in, among others, the GIJN Editors Pick Stories for the region from 2020 to 2023 and the decade before that. Links to these are available on the GIJN website. But I would say that Africa really needs to catch up to the rest of the muckraking world in raising these funds, that its news organizations need to support the production of investigative stories. Legacy media outlets have relinquished most of the investigative journalism role to nonprofit organizations, yet Africa does not have a robust corporate philanthropic culture to sustain their existence. As a result, nonprofit investigative groups in Africa mainly depend on small slices of funding from other regions, which are neither sufficient, unfortunately, in the short term, nor viable in the long term. So faced with such odds, can Africa really overcome its investigative journalism funding dilemma? To answer this question, these and more questions, GIJN is pleased to host this webinar in which we have a list of excellent experts who will share tips and insights on how to address the challenges to fundraising for investigative journalism in Africa. So a brief about the meeting rules. We have approximately 75 minutes for today's session. This will be divided between the discussion and the Q&A segment. We really do want to hear from you. So throughout the session, please feel free to send your questions and comments using the Q&A box on your screen. You don't have to wait until the end to submit your question. You can start by asking them as soon as they come to mind, and we will try to address as many of them as possible during the Q&A segment. After our speakers have shared their insights, Ben Onoluka from GIJN Africa will join us on the screen to moderate the Q&A session, and he will select questions from the Q&A box and facilitate a discussion that reflects your concerns and curiosities. I'd also like to inform everyone that we are recording this session. Then the recording will be available on the GIJN YouTube channel after the event, and this will allow you to revisit the discussion or even share it with your colleagues who couldn't join us today. A final request from me would be to ask everyone to please keep your questions and comments relevant to the topic at hand and be mindful of the diverse perspectives that we have in the room. Without further ado, I would love to introduce our wonderful speakers in the order that they will speak. We will start off with Dr. Shettima, who is the director of the Nigeria office at the MacArthur Foundation. He joined the foundation in 1999 and was previously responsible for grant making in 4 projects. Before joining the foundation, Dr. Shettima taught at the University of Maiduguri in Nigeria and the University of Toronto, Canada, and Ohio University as well in the US. He has a PhD from the University of Toronto, a master's degree from Ahmadu Bello University, and an undergraduate degree from the University of Maiduguri. Currently, he sits at the board of several organizations, including the GIJN Charity Development Foundation and the Sir Ahmadu Bello Memorial Foundation. Our next speaker will be Lebogang Mafada, who is a senior investment officer at the Media Development Investment Fund, which is a mission-driven investment fund that provides debt and equity financing to independent news and information companies. She actively manages MDIF's debt and equity portfolio projects in Africa and the MENA region. Lebo holds a Bachelor of Finance degree, cum laude, and is currently pursuing her master's in finance. She has worked in investment banking, private equity, asset management, and private wealth investment management, working in both primary and secondary markets across Africa for more than 15 years. Prior to joining MDIF in 2022, she worked at Circle Capital Global, IPRO Investments, and Dalberg Global Advisors. She sits on the board of directors of Africa Women in Media and the Sizwe Sibia Journalism Academy. And lastly, we have Mahmoud Kamara, who is the inaugural regional director for Africa and the Middle East at the International Fund for Public Interest Media, IFPIM. The fund was formed to foster a paradigm shift in how public interest media is resourced, with the goal of ensuring it is independent, inclusive, and resilient. Kamara, an expert in grant making, is responsible for guiding the fund's strategy and grant making across Africa and the Middle East. Before IFPIM, Kamara worked as a director at the Africa Transitional Justice Legacy Fund and as deputy director of global issues at Amnesty International. He holds an MSc with a distinction in development communication from the London School of Economics and Political Science, and a BA honors in mass communication from Fora Bay College, University of Sierra Leone. So before we start, a little bit of information about GIJN, for those of you who might not be familiar with it. The Global Investigative Journalism Network is the largest global network of non-profit investigative journalism organizations with 250 organizations in 91 countries. But it works with journalists everywhere, in non-profits, in commercial organizations, and with freelancers. It has an extensive range of resources and tip sheets to help journalists worldwide, which you can check on their website. We're truly honored to have such a distinguished experts list with us today, and I'm excited to dive into the discussion on how we can address the challenges and opportunities in fundraising for investigative journalism in Africa. Before I officially start, I'd like to share that unfortunately, Dr. Kole has another commitment and he won't be able to stay with us for the full session. We truly appreciate you for taking the time to be here with us today. So to the audience, I would request that if you have any questions for Dr. Kole as he presents, please type them in the Q&A box and we'll get to as many as we can before he leaves in the first part of the webinar. So let's start off with Dr. Kole Shettima. You're welcome.
Thank you very much, Fiona, for this wonderful introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good day, probably, to all of those who have joined us today at this event. And thank you very much for GIJN for inviting us to this conversation. And I will start by saying something about the MacArthur Foundation in the first slide, which is to say that, we at the MacArthur Foundation, our work is, on the next page, is around accountability and anti-corruption. And on focusing on anti-corruption and accountability, we do four things. One is we strengthen the criminal justice system. Secondly, we try to change people's behavior. Thirdly, we have what we call joint body, which is a Fijian English word for coming together, Ubuntu, or what you may also call collective work, collective work by civil society groups and organizations. And very important to this, our conversation today, is the work that we support around investigative journalism. So what I'm trying to say here is that we do not have a media per se work or journalism per se work, but we see our own work around investigative journalism as a means to an end, a means of how do we strengthen accountability and anti-corruption by supporting independent media. And that is where and how we come to this conversation. So unlike some of our other colleagues in many other organizations that may have, like, let's say, a media portfolio or a journalism portfolio or some portfolio that are dedicated for, supporting media for the sake of media itself, we are a little bit narrowed in the sense that we support journalism as a means of bringing about accountability and anti-corruption. And that is very important, I think, distinction that I just want to make. It's also important that, as we are also approaching other groups and organizations as an investigative journalist, maybe let's say this is a human rights organization, or maybe this is an environment organization, or this is a climate solution organization. Now, even though their focus is on climate change or climate solution, and they may not, come out and say that we are supporting investigative journalism, maybe digging further, and that's what will take me to the next slide, maybe digging further to find out under the work around climate change, do people also focus on using journalism as a means of bringing about climate solution? So they may not have a portfolio in many of those broad organizations. If you can move to the next slide. So even though organizations may not necessarily have a broad work around journalism and media, maybe working on climate change or human rights or sexual and gender-based violence or any of those kind of things, maybe one of the strategies that they are using is using investigative journalism as a means of advancing the cause that they are doing so. And that's what we do at the MacArthur Foundation, trying to look at, investigative journalism as a means of bringing about accountability and anti-corruption. So that's why this slide talks about you do your homework. Doing your homework means that, and this is a very common, it's a common thing that many of us will think is a common sense, but you find out that many of us actually are not doing our own homework on many things, trying to find out, okay, what do people support, what they don't support, and what strategies do they use in order to do the work that they are trying to do and other things. So I try to encourage people that, try to squeeze yourself into this conversation. Not necessarily that because somebody has said, oh, I'm supporting media and journalism like McMid, but because also somebody may say, oh, I am doing human rights work, but maybe within the human rights work, part of their own strategy is how do you use the media to do this work? So I think that, do our own homework, check their website, read about them, talk to colleagues and friends, terms who may be beneficiaries, conduct your own research, especially if you're investigating journalism. I guess one of the things that you are very good at is actually around conducting your own research. So I hope that, we will all be able to do our own research, do what, check what is possible and other things that are not possible before we actually come on to, approach whoever that we want to approach as well. So the next slide, which will come up now, one of the things that I think we have tried, and I think that Fiona mentioned about legacy media, and this is true. Legacy media are the one, our own work, even in Nigeria, I found them that they are the ones that are a little bit difficult to work with, especially when it comes to supporting them and funding them. I remember one or two organizations that I think that we really, really wanted to support them, and these are legacy media organizations. But I think that because they are, their era, so to speak, it's a different era from where we are now. So they were a little bit skeptical about, us and, whether what we want to do is like, I don't know whether they thought we were trying to employ them unnecessarily or something. But I found that legacy media are probably some of the most difficult ones to work with, just because probably, they don't really, when they started their own work and activities, it was a different time, it was a different frame of mind, and it was different orientation and than now. So the younger generation of media people who are online, who are on social media and other things, I think that they have been able to catch up, so to speak, about some of these more than the others. So, but I think that we try to even encourage the legacy media organizations to think about, okay, you don't want to, you don't want to this meddle, or don't want to mix up what you really know, what you want to do with other things. So think about establishing a non-for-profit organization. That might be, I think, a useful thing to do. And we encourage that one, not that we cannot support. In MacArthur, we can actually support for-profit organizations. There's no doubt about that one. But I think that a non-for-profit organization, in my view, gives a lot of leverage. For example, one, you get like 29% overhead cost. which is a huge amount of money that you can use in order to do whatever you want to do in other things. So that to me is a very important thing to second. Secondly, I think that if you have a non-profit arm, maybe you'll also be able to work with other civil society groups and organizations much more easier, rather than having a media organization trying to work with civil society and other things. And I think the advantage for me of working with other civil society organizations is that we know that media people, and they have told us in the work that we do in Nigeria that, look, we are one story, one investigation per hour, per day, and other things. If you want this work to live up beyond today and tomorrow, you need to engage with civil society groups and organizations who will now take whatever you produce as an advocacy material that they can use in order to advance the cause that you want to do in other things. So media organizations are good at what they know, which is, do good, excellent investigations. But how do you sustain those ideas and information and advocacy is something that only civil society groups are better in other things. So that's why in the work that we do at MacArthur Foundation Nigeria, one of the things that we try to encourage is to see how do we establish a relationship between the media organizations and civil society organizations, so that whatever the media organizations produce can now be amplified by the civil society groups and organizations. But the other important aspect of this is that, as you know, civil society groups also need certain things, but they know they don't have access, which only the media organizations will have access to them and other things. So they come to us and say, look, we really want to know about something, but we don't have the credentials and the legitimacy to act those kind of things. We don't have the skills to do this kind of thing. So they work with media organizations and say, okay, can you help us to investigate something about something? And they then investigate it, and then civil society is able to use it. And so I think that this kind of relationship between civil society organizations and media organizations are important. And I think that establishing a not-for-profit is another thing. The third element of the work is the work around working as a cohort. And this is what I think that GIJN has done very well in many ways. But I think at the national level also is, how do we encourage our own investigative journalists to work as a cohort? How can we ensure that, for example, a story published by News One or to be published is actually published by 5, 6 organizations at the same time? I think that the impact of that is critical and very important. And also that I think it gives solidarity and support, and therefore also makes it difficult for state actors to just come in. Let's say we are going to close down one newspaper or new magazine because of one story, but that if you want to do that, then you have to close like 5, 6, 7 organizations at the same time. And I think that makes it a bit difficult for them to do that. So that's why I think that working as a cohort is very important. Working with civil society organizations, open cohort, and that's why I think that maybe establishing a civil non-profit organization is very important as well. But also, I think that working as a civil society non-profit is also to show your own corporate responsibility, a sense of what are you doing for the community that you're working with. I think that people will be very happy to know that, for example, X legacy paper or whatever they do, they also care about their own community, and they are doing either scholarship or health activities or whatever they do. I think that is also another way of showing their own support to the communities that they do in other things. The next slide, please. This is a topic that I'm sure Magmeet is going to talk about because he's the Gen Z generation, unlike myself, who's a legacy generation on that one. But just to say that I think that leveraging technology is critical and very important. And two down that I thought were very important is one of GPS. I think that I've seen a lot of good work that have been done with GPS, especially in geolocating either dead bodies or geolocating IDP camps or geolocating victims of crimes and other things. So I think that GPS is important, but also using virtual reality, I think it's very important as well, whereby, journalists are actually able to bring to people real life about what does it mean for the kind of thing that is happening in other places that probably we can only read about it, but actually bringing it to people's mind and attention as well. The next slide, please. So I also want to suggest, people also approaching us and working on lower levels of governments and communities. I know, for example, in the work that we do in Nigeria, there's a lot of people who want to focus on Abuja, and Abuja is very important, but there are many communities and many lower level government that are more than Abuja, the capital. There are provinces, there are states, there are local government councils, And there are so many things that are happening. And for many ordinary people, really, what is most important is what is happening in their own community, because that is where they have a direct relationship with the state and other things. So although they may have a relationship with the national government, I think that less focus try to also focus at lower. And then focusing on the private sector, I think is critical in my view, in terms of investigations. Many of you who have read the Mbeki report about the capital flight of the continent, we all know that the majority of the corruption actually takes place in the private sector. Although we tend to focus mostly on the public sector, but I think it's important. And of course, what GIJN does good is also the cross-border work. I know that it's very difficult, but I think it's very important that we also focus on what happens within across our countries, and not because anything that happens in South Africa will have an impact in Zimbabwe and vice versa. Same thing in whether North Africa, East Africa, West Africa. So these are very important things that I think we should also be focusing on. The next slide, which is to conclude that I don't think we need to say anything more than that. This is a very, very critical and very important work that we have to do and others. At least in the Nigerian Constitution, the fourth realm in the Constitution says that fourth realm of government is the media. So that shows the importance and the critical role that the media plays in our society. But we know also it's a very, very expensive activity, especially if you want to do high quality work. I think we need the skills. We need because I think that, I see a lot of reports that say it's investigative journalism, but my fear is that these are just part of the normal reports that I read in other things. They don't really stand up to the quality of what we can consider as investigative journalism. So this is critical work that every one of you is doing. Very important work because it really transforms people's lives and other things. I have seen it with my eyes on how investigative journalism have made possible for people to go to school, have saved lives in terms of accidents, have saved lives in terms of maternal health and mortality, of enabling young people to have access to reproductive health and services. So this is a question of life and death in my view. And that's why I think that we need to be supportive of it. We need the skills, and we need to address the quality issues as well. And just to thank everyone, which is the last slide, for giving me the opportunity to share this moment with all of you. Thank you very much, Fiona.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kole, for those very insightful remarks. I couldn't agree more with what you've said. But before you leave, I would love to open the floor for a few questions from the audience, specifically for you. So I would leave it over to Benin to share some of the questions.
Thank you, Fiona, and hello, everyone. It's good to have you in this webinar. We have two questions, Dr. Kole, that you are directed to you. The first one is from Okech Kendo. Okech Kendo says he's an investigative journalism lecturer, and he says, how can periodic training sessions for investigative journalists be funded?
You're a lecturer. One of the things I think is important for us to do is how do we strengthen the university system to produce a curriculum, free service, so that we train the best of the journalists. Because currently, for example, we support a number of organizations do training of out of service or in service journalists. And this is important, critical. But I think that in the long run, in my view, I think the focus should be around supporting curriculum development in our universities so that all the students who are coming to any communication department, any journalism program is well equipped and well strengthened for them to do this kind of work that you are teaching your own students to do. So at the moment, let me say that yes, we support a number of organizations, and I can just say that I think in Nigeria, probably we are up to supporting more than 80 organizations who are doing journalism work. Some of them at lower levels of government, some of them at the national levels of government. We do that well. But I think that what we really need to focus upon is how do we change our curriculum so that the next generation of investigative journalists like you will have the same skills that are necessary for our society. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that response. There's another question from Amadou Lamrana Ba, I think which is related. Amadou says, how do we promote cross-border collaboration to investigative stories? And I think this is in context of funding cross-border investigations. What tips do you have for those who are keen to do collaborative investigations that are cross-border, but do not have the funds to finance them?
Yeah, and this is very important. Unfortunately, most of us in the funding agencies are very much bilateral in so many ways in the way that we do our work. We focus on countries. There are not many people who are really looking at cross-border issues and other things. So what we have tried to do in our own context is to try to see how do we, for example, enable our friends from Ghana to do some work with their colleagues in Nigeria. And sometimes we claim that, there are some skills that are there in Ghana that are not here in Nigeria, and that has enabled us to make a case for it. So although we make the case for the cross-border from Nigeria, we make the case as, there's a skill gap, and therefore let's try to see how can we use that skill gap in order to improve the quality of work that we are doing in Nigeria. Or in terms of the support we give to premium times, and trying to say that, look, many of the things that are happening in Nigeria are actually impacted by what happens, whether in Sierra Leone or in Ghana or in other parts of things. So that's the way in which we try to make the case for that one. But unfortunately, as I say that, a lot of our works are very much, silo in terms of the watch approach, but we try to make a case in terms of skill gaps or the impact of the other places on the place that we work. So that's why we try to be very creative in trying to see how we can do this work and other things. And yeah, that's what I want to say. Thank you, Bernard.
Okay, thank you. There are other questions about funding, but they are very specific, so I think I will not go into that. But there is one very important question here from Suleiman, who works with the Center for Media Policy and Accountability in Abuja, Nigeria. Suleiman says he's an investigative journalism researcher, and his question is, how do we fund investigative journalism research? For example, to review the impact of investigative journalism in Nigeria. Is that something that the MacArthur Foundation funds? And is it an area that you look at as something you would be happy to fund?
Well, I think Suleiman is very much aware. The current work we do here in Nigeria on this one comes to an end in the next 3-4 months. I think that it's very important for us to really understand, what is the impact of the work that we have done in itself, because as I said, we support like 80 media organizations in Nigeria, and that I think it's very important for us to know, are we making any difference or not. Already we have a learning and evaluation partner, which we have been working with for the last 8 years, just try to track, in terms of the work we are doing, what is impact, what the quality of the work we are doing and other things. But I think that any additional work that will try to, explain to us what we are trying to do, whether it is making any difference, I think it's a very important thing for us to do, just even for our own sanity and to make sure that there are lessons that we can learn as well.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Shettima, and I think we'll stop it there. In case there are other questions, we will find a way to get them to you, but thank you so much, and thank you again for sparing your time.
And MacMate is there, and Lebo Ganga there. I'm sure they will all answer all the questions that there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Back to you, Fiona.
Thank you, Benon, and thank you once again, Dr. Kole. We really appreciate. So building on that momentum, I'd like to now invite Lebo to share her thoughts, particularly around building resilient, scalable, and investable media businesses in line with this conversation that we're having. You're welcome, Lebo.
Thank you, Fiona. Just sharing my slide. Excuse me. So my name is Lebo Khan Mapada. I work for the Media and Development Investment Fund. MDIF is a not-for-profit impact investment fund. We give out loans and equity for media that operate in challenging environments. Please excuse me, I have a nagging cough that's been nagging me for a few weeks, so please excuse my voice, but I'll try to be as clear as possible. So MDIF invests in media businesses in challenging environments, and we specifically we do not give out grants. We're not a grant-making organization. We offer loans and equity. Our work in Africa spans across 8 countries. Apart from the investments that we make, the loans and the equity investments that we make, we also have capacity building programs. In Nigeria, we have what we call the NAMIP program. In South Africa, it's called Amplify South Africa. And this work that we do is part of how we try to strengthen the ecosystem, the media ecosystem in Africa, which, as we all know, is fraught with many challenges. And a lot of the work that we do, especially in our capacity building programs, is that we try to encourage portfolio companies and investees to follow just a few basic fundamentals in building up their business and building up resilience, because we want to encourage businesses to be resilient and sustainable beyond just the next paycheck, beyond just the current project you're working on. You need to build a business that is resilient and sustainable. And so how we do that is that we encourage a few basic fundamentals, which is what I'm going to share in the next few minutes. And the first one is that especially when it comes to fundraising, we encourage you to have a basic understanding of the funding landscape. And I'm going to give a disclaimer here that this slide is not exhaustive. So if you don't see your organization's name mentioned here, please don't be offended. It's not exhaustive, but it's just a big picture overview of who are the players in the African media landscape. And I use the term investing very loosely to really mean who are the organizations supporting media in Africa. And these are different players who offer different levels of support, which ranges from training, from capacity building, grant making, debt or equity. And there are many of them, but as we all know, these resources are finite. And so your job as a media practitioner is to understand this landscape, understand the investors, and a lot of the work that goes into understanding the landscape is research and preparation. And so a good starting point is just to do Google search on these organizations, or find a database. There are many databases that will give you information on investors and their profiles, and what you want to understand is who they are, what kind of funding do they provide. And when you understand what the kind of funding they provide, then you will be able to measure your goals against their criteria. So investors will typically have a specific industry they focus on. They may have a geographic focus, whether they focus on Africa as a whole, globally, or they have a country-specific focus. So you need to do that research and understand what they look for. And other investors or funders have a minimum size investment. So if for example, you're targeting an organization that has a minimum, say, of $500,000, and you know that your company cannot absorb that kind of investment, then maybe you want to partner with someone else for that specific grant. So this is why that research is important. And lastly, the research also has to help you to understand whether the funder has any additional value that they can bring to you. A lot of times, when you are running a business, especially in Africa, because the ecosystem is so fragmented, there's not a lot of support structures. So you want to find a partner, you want to find an investor or a funder who comes, if you can, who comes alongside you as a partner, who can open doors for you, who can help you perhaps with hiring, help you with strategy. But it's just something that you should look out for. Don't just accept any check because it's free, it's money, but just look for added advantage, value adds that investors can also offer you, because it will help you in making your business more sustainable in the long run. Secondly, what we encourage media businesses to do is to build a strong business foundation. And the main idea here is that you want to set yourself up for success. So when we talk about corporate governance, for example, we want you to cover all the basics and make it easy for an investor to work with you. Corporate governance and transparency, it gives legitimacy to your business. It eliminates red flags for a funder who wants to put money in your business to know that, you're registered as a business, you're compliant with all the legal and regulatory compliances, all of those things. They work in your favor. So, and secondly, this is a common, the diversity of skills. The reason we have it here, I have it here, is it's a common challenge that we have seen that what tends to happen in media organizations is that the CEO or the managing director wears many hats. He doubles up as the HR manager, the chief accountant, sales and development, and he wears many hats. But the truth of the matter is that superheroes only exist in movies. And so it doesn't inspire confidence to an investor when your MD is everything else. He's also the editor-in-chief. Obviously, if he falls sick or she falls sick, the business shuts down, and that happens a lot of times. So you have to really take time to think about the diversity of skills in your organization. And obviously, it's very expensive to have all of these skill sets in-house. So sometimes you can consider outsourcing some of these resources or partnering with people within your network and figuring out how you can subsidize the costs of these services so that you can have these skills within your business. And obviously, a really important skill set is having a finance professional in your business, because obviously the work of fundraising is all about money, and you have to have a person who is acquainted with how to calculate your cash flow, how to project your budget, how to calculate your runway. And when you're working on fundraising, you need to understand your cash flow needs. You need to give yourself enough runway for your business, because at the end of the day, you're running a business. You're not just doing a single project. You want to raise enough funding to be able to sustain your business beyond just one project or beyond a certain scope. Typically, we encourage our investees to when you're raising funds, just to look at a minimum of 12 to 18 months runway. Give yourself at least 12 to 18 months to be able to continue running your business. And finally, a big part of fundraising is storytelling. And this would obviously come naturally to you as journalists. You have to tell the story. And if you don't measure and track your impact, it's difficult to tell that story. And the reason that this matters is because a track record of success, it helps you with future funding. Because investors and funders, they want to see the impact of the money that they've given you. They want to know that you're doing good. They want to see mission alignment, right? They want to see that the investment that they made in your business is aligned with their mission, and that they can report back to their board or to their funders to say that it's actually making a difference in the communities that in the businesses that they're investing in. And then finally, I want to talk about how you leverage value from within your network. So the reality is that you can do all of the work of planning, of researching, and you've ticked all the boxes, but sometimes the funding doesn't come through. Sometimes you do qualify, but sometimes you don't get that funding. And so what do you do when your bills are due? And at the end of the month, you have to pay salaries, you have to pay utilities, and the funding has run dry. You've tried different types of revenue diversification, and nothing is working. And because the reality is that the landscape in Africa is very difficult right now for doing business in general. It's not unique to media sector. It's a universal problem. And we have to be able to think about how we overcome these challenges just beyond the traditional means of getting external funding, especially in an environment where external funding is so finite and revenues are declining. And so one of the ways that we, as MDIF, as I mentioned earlier, we have capacity building programs such as NAMIB and Amplify South Africa. And these exist to strengthen the ecosystem. It's a network of media organizations, either in Nigeria or South Africa, and we have a regional program in Southern Africa, where we've created this network of organizations that can work together and collaborate to overcome peculiar challenges that they face in the ecosystem. And we've seen many successes. This slide is just a snapshot of some of the examples of how our program participants have worked together and successfully, overcome certain challenges, whether it's resource related or, office space or revenue sharing, diversification of revenue. So, but the main thing that we've seen is that, media organizations need to stop seeing each other as competition. The only way you survive in this ecosystem that is so challenging is that you need to stop seeing each other as competition and rather focus on helping each other to survive. And how you do that is through partnership, through sharing of knowledge, sharing of resources, and collaboration. I just want to end off by just saying the three key things on this slide is on collaboration is that you need to find a partner who has who can gain mutual value from a project. When you're thinking about collaborating, find yourself a partner who has something to gain. You have to both have skin in the game. You have to both be motivated for that collaboration to work. You have to have clear communication. Have it in writing, have an agreement if you're going to share revenues, if you're going to lease out your office to some other company, then have a lease agreement. And sometimes if you need someone in legal to go over those agreements, do so that everybody is clear in what is expected from both sides of the table. And finally, I would say just keep an entrepreneurial mindset. Just be open to new ideas. As we said from the beginning, Fiona said it at the beginning, that there are challenges in this ecosystem. And so we need to keep an open mind and think outside the box and explore new ways of doing business, of finding new revenues. And with that, I am done. Thank you. Over to you, Fiona.
Thank you so much, Lebo. It was really a great perspective on the topic. It actually answered the question that I had for you on what best practices could you share with us, but I feel like to Mahmoud to hear his views on the importance of having separate entities for investigative journalism to manage risks and liabilities. Over to you, Mahmoud.
Thank you very much, Fiona, and thank you to colleagues at GIJN. Perhaps I can also start prior to just going to my point, the questions that you've asked, by introducing the International Fund for Public Interest Media. For those of you who don't know, the International Fund for Public Interest Media was launched in 2021 at the UN. But prior to the launch of the fund, a feasibility study was conducted with research conducted in multiple countries to understand the challenges that independent public interest media face across the world. Since 2021, we are currently operating in 50 countries, in low and middle income countries across the world. And the vision of the fund is to unlock existing and new financial resources for public interest journalism in low and middle income countries. Our focus is primarily independent public interest media in countries in Africa, selected countries in Africa, Latin America, and the Asia Pacific region, as well as in Eastern Europe. We are headquartered in France, but we have a regional headquarters in Ghana, from where I'm calling. In fact, the Africa Regional Headquarters is the first for the International Fund. We are a very different but bold multilateral institution. In fact, we are the first international institution for public interest media that is dedicated exclusively to support independent public interest journalism across the world. We operate with a mandate to support media under 3 broad impact goals. The first one is around media survival and sustainability. Now, the feasibility study showed that independent public interest media in different parts of the global majority are struggling. Many cannot thrive or survive beyond 6 months. Some are going on a monthly basis, others are considerably shrinking their production. Journalists are being laid off. We have situations where media outlets are unable to pay their journalists. And so they go for months without salaries. But this has led to the kind of reduction, significant reduction in the quality of journalism that is produced by independent media. We have seen situations where in countries that are experiencing frequent electricity challenges, media outlets cannot even buy fuel for the generator, or even buy generator, so let alone fuel. So they are struggling, and this is where we come in. We come in by providing core flexible funding to media outlets with the principal goal of ensuring that they are sustained, that they keep the lights on, and they keep publishing. Because we're going to talk about fundraising here if the media outlet itself is not in existence, right? So our first primary target is to ensure that we keep the media from what we call the media extinction events. A lot of quality media outlets are shutting down, or perhaps just falling up, or are at risk of being captured, not just by corporate interests, but also by political interests. So our first impact goal is to keep media going and keep the survival of the media alive. Our second is perhaps very linked to the question that you've mentioned and this discussion, which is about supporting media transformation for economic resilience. What do we mean by this? We know from just what we've heard and from the fact that GIJN has received a lot of requests from its membership to understand how to raise money, that a lot of institutions want to transform their thinking, want to transform their business model, want to do good quality journalism, but there is just not money. There's just no resources for them to do the work. So what we do, in addition to ensuring that the media is supported to sustain itself, we also support media outlets to transform their thinking and their business model with the principal focus on economic resilience. Economic resilience here is to ensure that, or just to build on what Lebogang mentioned, to ensure that you have a runway, to ensure that while you're doing one thing, you're not at risk of losing other things that are crucial to the running of your institution. So we support under this category the ethical use of technology to ensure that you maximize the impact of your content that you're producing, that you maximize the reach of your audience. You know, a lot of outlets have huge audience and following, but they don't know how to take advantage of their audience and their reach. But also to ensure that you prevent yourself, you create a wall on the independence of your editorial products. So that is the second impact goal of the fund. The third and final one in this first phase of operation is to support the media ecosystem, because we've realized that it is important to support individual media outlets, but the kind of long-term impact of our intervention will be more valuable when we support initiatives that are valuable or that are meant for the entire ecosystem in a particular media market. And this is where we've supported initiatives like the National Fund for Public Interest Media in Sierra Leone, and supporting similar initiatives in Brazil through AJO, supporting the Association of Independent Press Publishers in South Africa, and supporting a research currently in the Middle East, the Arab region, to explore the possibility of what a regional fund for public interest media in the Arab region could be like. So these are all the kind of initiatives that we support as a financing mechanism. I also want to just emphasize that the International Fund for Public Interest Media is a financing mechanism. As I mentioned earlier, our role is to unlock revenue, financial revenue for public interest media in low and middle income countries. We don't give grants for capacity building in that sense of organizing workshops and training. Our grants are core flexible funding for the media to operate so that they have the leverage, they have the space to undertake work that firstly strengthens and advances their independence and the quality of their work. Having said that, I'd like to go now to some of the core tips, speaking from a grant maker's perspective. I'd like to go into the core tips on what we look at when we want to make grants to institutions, especially media institutions. And I'll come back to some of the initiatives that we have supported across Africa and the Middle East. Our first issue is very important. First point is that you focus on the issue and not necessarily all the time on the money. And what we found is that a lot of people follow the money in the sense of trying to get the money, not follow where the money goes, because I know there's a follow the money initiative that investigates corruption. What I'm referring to here is how you ensure that your product is focused on the issue that is of societal value. Very important. Ensure that whatever investigative piece that you decide to undertake, it should be something that is of societal value. It is not something that is just suits your own institutional ego or institutional interest. You have to connect the issue with society. To what extent is this important to the society? Because when you focus on the issue and the societal value of that issue, the money you will attract the money will come, funders will come to you. That is the first advice. The second one is that as investigative journalism outfit and entity, you have to create a virtuous upward circle of quality. What do I mean by this? Now, your principal aim is to start with quality and not diminish quality because you want to get money, or a funder has issued a call for proposal and they have so many conditions and restrictions, and that you forget about how that will impact on the quality of your work because you want to produce more for this funder. A lot of the time we focus on the quantity of the outputs. When people pitch ideas to funders, they think that if you say, I'm going to produce 70 investigative pieces between now and next year, December, the funder will give you money. The moment you mention that as a funder, I will know that you're not being realistic, you're overpromising. Do not overpromise. Make sure you create a virtuous upward circle of quality and not quantity. And because the quality of your content is what attracts us as funders and not necessarily the quantity of those content. The second thing that you should be mindful of as an investigative a journalist or an outfit that does investigative journalism is to be realistic with your own time frame, with the understanding that investigation takes time and fundraising takes even longer time. So if you are patient with your own investigative work, you should also learn to be patient with your fundraising work. Now, a lot of the time we see that there is the speed to get money, to get more money, and that desire to get money quickly affects not just quantity or the quality of the work, but also affects the editorial integrity of your investigative piece. Now, I want to emphasize here that the editorial integrity of investigative journalism or investigative outfit or any media outfit has a direct implication on your fundraising capacity. If you see that your work is not strong enough, it doesn't have depth, it doesn't have kind of broader societal value, it doesn't have any connection with your audience, we will not be keen to give you money. We would rather go to institutions that are doing really high quality work and with stronger potential for impact. So my advice would be for you to have an agenda, produce content with an agenda for societal value. I think I have repeated this more than once now because it's important. The next thing is about connection with your audience. Have an audience engagement strategy. Now, most of the time, we see that everybody wants to do investigative journalism. Everybody considers or calls themselves as an investigative journalist. Many of them have the outlets, they have an output, but there's no connection between that outlet, the output, and the audience that they're producing that content for. So for us at the International Fund, one of the things that we ask when we engage and through our direct solicitation for proposals, and even in our recent open call for proposal, it's about the audience. To what extent are you serving the audience? To what extent are you serving or your products and serving the community? Because at the end of the day, that is the value that we look for. You know, the return for money. My alarm has gone off, telling me that I've got to my 10 minutes. So I'm going to probably just mention a few more things, if you don't mind, Fiona. That I want to wrap up, and then the others can come in a question and answer session. Then the last point, last couple of points that I want to mention is that we should avoid, as investigative journalists, avoid the bright and shiny. A lot of the time, everybody follows the bandwagon. They want to go for the bright and shiny topics and to investigate. But there are certain issues that are not bright and shiny in the sense of the word, in the literal sense of the word, but they are importance to the community and that issue affects, whether it's about water scarcity and how local authorities are diverting money that is meant for the production of water. Because these things affect the bread and butter issues of the day for those ordinary people. And as founders, we want to see how your work has bearing or connection to your community and the audience that you're seeking to serve, or how it will have impact on policy and other governance challenges in your community and in your society. Another thing perhaps we could end here with, I'll leave the rest to the question, is for investigative journalists to know that fundraising is friend raising. Make friends with grant makers, with donors, reach out. I don't want to repeat all the other points that have been mentioned by Lebo and Dr. Kole, but this is very important because sometimes it is through referrals that you get funding. It's not even through open calls. Sometimes you see open calls and you don't think that you meet the criteria or the eligibility list, but through referrals, through credible connections that you've made with other people who really see your work and value it, you will be able to attract some funding. I'll pause there, and I hope that I have been able to respond to those questions. Thank you very much. Over to you, Fiona.
Thank you so much, Mahmoud. It was very, very enlightening, I must add. I do have a question, but perhaps you can also address this during the Q&A session. Dr. Kole had mentioned you as the Gen Z in the room about the use of technology, to support investigative journalism fundraising. And I would love to hear more on that as we receive more questions. If I may add something just before we break into the Q&A session, I'd say this discussion ties in to some of the best practices we have in our GFMD fundraising guide. If you may allow me to quickly pitch that on, because I've seen a very recurring narrative from our donors and our panelists here today that may have answers through our fundraising guide, because our fundraising guide offers excellent insights and strategies on how to identify and approach these global donors, We do have a mapping of donors available on the guide, which will help you, as Dr. Kole said, do your homework. And also, as Lebo said, understand the donors and their landscape. So I encourage everyone to explore this guide as they refine their fundraising strategies, because we have comprehensive resources which offer insights as well. And also we have modules and fundraising lexicons, donor mapping, webinars, and other resources that not everyone has access to. And we hope that it acts as a guide in your fundraising efforts. We have heard proper feedback from our members as well, sharing such good news about how the guide has helped them through their fundraising efforts. So I will share it here in the chat for our audience to have a chance to look at it when they get the chance. I also do want to leave a question to the panelists, but not to be answered here, but as a food for thought, which is, what steps can be taken to improve coordination among donors supporting investigative journalism in Africa? This is me playing devil's advocate, just to try and understand also from our audience perspective how they can better position themselves to benefit from this coordinated support. On that note, I want to say thank you to the panelists for the insightful discussions. I think we've covered a lot of ground today. And now we want to hear the questions from our audience. I'm sure there's several questions already shared in the chat, and we look forward to covering them. So in this session, to help facilitate the Q&A session, I'm pleased to introduce Benon from the GIJN Africa team, who will be joining us on screen to moderate your questions. Benon has extensive experience in investigative journalism, and I'm very sure that he will ensure that your questions are addressed effectively. Over to you, Benon.
Okay, thank you, Fiona. I have personally been trying to respond to some of the questions that I could in the chat box, but I'm overwhelmed with the number of questions. So I'm happy to pass them on to Mahmoud, Lebo, and yourself, Fiona, since you're involved in the space as well. And I guess you could represent Kole in this instance by responding to some of the questions. So the first set of questions are coming from Robert Kitui, who is an investigative journalist based in East Africa. And I suggest perhaps you pick a pen, if you could, and record some of these questions. Robert has 3 questions. The first one is, what strategies can non-profit investigative journalism groups in Africa use to attract interest from global funders? And how can they also enhance their appeal to local foundation funding? I think that's a very important question. The second one is, how can small startups like ours, which originally aimed to support investigative journalists with resources, documents, data sets, effectively secure funding and support to also transition into publishing complete investigative projects, especially where legacy media sometimes develop cold feet to publish their work due to pressure from those adversely mentioned. That's question 2. Question 3 is, what alternative media financing opportunities should African journalism groups explore beyond the conventional funding sources, and how can they better tap into these opportunities? Those are 3 critical questions, and I think I'll just leave it open to all of you to respond to whichever question you find you are keen to respond to. Thank you.
Let me try and tackle some of them. I think the first question was, I can't recall exactly, but it was non-profits, and I think I'll leave that one to Mahmoud to answer.
Yeah. What strategies can non-profit investigative journalism groups in Africa use to attract interest from global funders, and how can they also enhance their appeal to local foundation funding?
Right. So as I mentioned at MDIF, we are not a grant-making organization. We don't offer philanthropic services, but we do offer loans and debt and equity investments. And so I guess in answering the third question, which is about what options are available, what other options are available for funding. Typically in Africa, when we, apart from when we invest in African media businesses, we offer safes and convertible debt. Those are some of the options that are not very, they're not unique, but they're not very common in media in Africa. And so what it is that a safe is a simple agreement for future equity. And a convertible loan is basically, and in both cases, what happens is that the investor or the lender invests in your business and you accept that money based on a future agreement. So you don't necessarily give up equity in your business when you sign up for a safe. You don't give up equity immediately. You don't suffer dilution immediately, but it only happens, you agree to convert that investment at a future date. And what the advantage of using safes and convertible loans is that it gives your business the opportunity to grow and to accumulate value, so that when that investment actually converts to equity, your company will be more valuable, and so it limits the dilution in your business. Whereas opposed to if you accept an investment today, when your business is still a small startup, you will have to suffer a lot of dilution. And so those are some of the ways we try to support media startups through the investments that we make. And the other question I thought I'd tackle was how to transition from the second question. If you could repeat it, please, Benon.
Okay. The second question is, how can small startups like Robert Kitui's, which originally aimed to support investigative journalists with resources, documents, datasets, etc., effectively secure funding and support to also transition into publishing complete investigative projects? And he's talking about this in the context that legacy media sometimes develop cold feet to publish their work due to pressure from those they write about.
So I wanted to, okay, thank you, Ben. I just wanted to say on this part that, and I think Dr. Colley spoke about it in his presentation, and we've seen a lot of this as well, that a lot of media organizations, they adopt a dual corporate structure, where you register a for-profit arm and a not-for-profit arm, and that allows you to have access to different types of funding. And so even if you are a not-for-profit, once you have a dual corporate structure, it gives you the flexibility to now pursue funding that would not necessarily have been available to you, so that you can pursue different projects. I'll hand over to Mahmoud to add on to that.
All right, thank you very much, Lebo. And thank you, Robert, for those very useful questions. In response to your first question about strategies that non-profit investigative journalism groups in Africa can use to attract interests from global funders, my first answer will be go for the low-hanging fruits. What we have found in a number of cases is that people start small, and most times they consider themselves as non-profits, and but they want to go for the big grants. They want to go for the 300 or 400 and 500. It is very good to have high ambitions. It is very good to aim at the sky so you can fall at the mountaintop. But I'll tell you, as a founder, if I see that you are a small group, and I think this might probably even kind of answer the second question about small startups. You try and focus on what your low-hanging fruits are. What can you be able to do with a small grants, for instance, that will firstly make your proposal realistic and measurable, and that you don't have to invest a lot of your time trying to convince others to give you money. Also look for intermediaries. There are a lot of organizations that are serving as grant-making intermediaries within the continent and outside. They are not necessarily the big funders, because there's a lot of pressure on the big founders. I'll tell you, everybody wants to get money from the big foundations and the big philanthropic institutions, which means that if you're not known and if you don't have this connection, if you've not been doing work to really show the impact of your products at the general level, you get swallowed up by the others who are well known. So I would say avoid, perhaps in a way, I've tried to avoid first those big foundations because they have a very stringent requirements in the first place. And most times they only have like one program officer who may not be able to see everybody and see everything in the proposals that come in. So if you try and target intermediaries that operate within the continent or within your region of operation, explore relationships with those and see what their strategic focus is and how whether the strategies align with yours. Because like Lebo said earlier, don't allow yourself to be mission driven. Just because you want to follow the money, you want to get money, you are applying for every apple that you see out there. So focus on the low-hanging fruit, focus and try to engage with regional intermediaries. And but also, I think Dr. Kolo mentioned this. How do you collaborate with donors, NGOs who already have money, but they need people who can produce content for them in a way that reveals. It can be a research, but it's investigative research. And they will be able to give you the kind of grants that the big foundations will not be able to give you. And again, just to repeat myself, try to create this virtuous circle of quality. Start small with high quality and build on every product that you produce has to improve on the quality of the previous one. That will attract international funders to give you grants or money. And alternative media financing opportunities African journalists should explore. What I have found in a number of countries in Africa and in other parts of the world is that investigative journalists tend to go for fellowship opportunities. There are a number of fellowships. I don't think a lot of people explore these opportunities. There are some paid fellowships that give you money, to investigate something, to research something. It's not necessarily called investigative grants or investigative journalism grants, but it's the research grant that will give you the freedom and the scope to actually investigate the issue that you care about and you want to. It's quite an unorthodox and non-conventional approach, and I've seen this done in Latin America and in other parts of the world. I'm not quite sure about people who have explored it yet in the continent. I know of a few people whose name I may not mention right now, but they try this as fellows. They applied for fellowships because they have an issue that they want to investigate, and that fellowship gave them money. And sometimes you have a lot of freedom with the fellowship grants to do your investigation than the regular grants, which will require you to tick a lot of boxes. So it is not always the case because these fellowships are very hard to come by, but I think these are also alternative media financing opportunities. Of course, the International Fund is a financing mechanism. We don't give grants to individuals, and the kind of criteria for our grants are all on the website, but we want to ensure that we give grants to institutions that have a wider audience reach, that are not publicly listed, and that have a strong editorial independence and editorial integrity, and that are not owned by a politically exposed person, and that have connections with their audience. So we have all of these criteria that we give, what we use to give grants. And we also work with other institutions who do provide small grants because our grant sizes are quite high. So that's what I would encourage people to go for, institutions that do give those small grants rather than only focusing on the big foundations. I don't know if I've answered the questions. If there's any other question that is left.
Yes, yes, you have. Thank you. There are some questions, some more questions, a couple of them from my friend and mentor, Evelyn Groning, who says, are funders grappling with the increasing operational in some countries, and is it necessary to publish outside this country sometimes? Two, she says, we find that individual journalists often are the knights in shining armor who do amazing work, but if they don't have a media house or a center, sometimes without the capacity, they don't have the capacity to set up an NGO, they can only apply to small individual grants. Why not a fund for journalists? Three, grants are often theme-based, which doesn't help those who come across injustices they need to expose that don't fit within the theme. How can this be addressed? I'll just stop there for now.
I will start with the theme-based grants, and this is why the International Fund is different, because we don't give grants based on themes. I mentioned our impact goals, right? On those kind of issues that are more focused on the institutional strengthening of media outlets and ensuring that they are economically resilient and they're able to transform themselves for the long run. So unlike other funders, we don't give grants for thematic reporting, for instance. The grants that we give are core funding, core flexible funding, which you can use to pay salaries, pay rents, and buy equipment for the running of things. Some institutions don't even have the basic recorders for their journalists to go out and do interviews. The grants that we give help to address these kinds of challenges for the media outlets, and not necessarily limiting an institution to say, okay, you have to report on climate change, or you have to report on environmental rights issues, or other themes that are out there. We don't do that. So, and this is where the research comes in. I think Levo mentioned it, and Dr. Coley also mentioned it earlier. We should, before even applying, I think it's very crucial for you to do some kind of funderscaping, mapping of the various funders, the various issues they fund, the various timelines of the calls for their proposals, and a number of issues that will give you a better sense of what they fund, who they fund, where the geographical scope of their funding, and the kind of issues that they supported to be supported over the years. So I think that might probably help address this challenge of people feeling, kind of cut off as a result of the fact that most of the funding are theme-based. But the International Fund does not support or give grants based on themes. The other question is why not a fund for journalists from Evelyn? So our fund, as is IFBIM, we know that we are operating in a market or in a space that has other institutions. A lot of other funders are already supporting a wide range of issues, whether it's training journalists, whether it's capacity enhancements and building, whatever. So we want to ensure that we address a gap that exists, a gap that has been identified from the feasibility study and research that was conducted prior to the launch of the fund, a gap that has been made known to us by other funders and other media development organizations. So we focus on the institution because that is what will ensure that the impact is spread across the market, and it's not limited to individual persons. And it will also help because we want to look at the kind of the bigger picture, not the in as much as individual journalists are very important for the market. I think our argument and our hypothesis is that funding the institutions and the ecosystem has a much more broader result for everyone and for the media fraternity. So that is why I think we don't specifically give individual grants, because you have bloggers, everybody will be very hard to manage. So that probably hopefully responds to that question. I'll pause there while I give you a chance to go through the other questions, Benon. I don't know if And there was another question addressed to me from Evelyn.
Yes, unfortunately, Mahmoud, we've run out of time, but I have shared all your social media accounts, LinkedIn and Twitter, and I would encourage our audience, if you have a question directed to either Lebo or Mahmoud or Kole or Fiona, please reach out to them via their social media handles that I have shared with you. Thank you for all the questions. It's been an engaging discussion, and I'll now pass back to Fiona to conclude. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ben. And as you've said, unfortunately, it's the conclusion of the session. It's been an incredibly insightful discussion. I've been nodding throughout, and I hope everyone in the audience found it as valuable as I did. So first and foremost, I'd like to extend my deepest thanks to our panelists, Dr. Kole, Lebo, Mahmoud. Your expertise and perspectives and candid sharing have shed so much light on the complex yet crucial topic of fundraising for investigative journalism in Africa. Thank you so much for your time and for your invaluable contributions as well. A big thank you also goes out to GIJN for organizing and supporting this event, as well as to our engaged audience for your participation and thoughtful questions. Your involvement is what makes these discussions so dynamic and impactful, and I can see that through the questions that have been shared. Lastly, I encourage you to follow GIJN Africa on Twitter and visit their website for updates for future events, resources, and opportunities that can help you continue the important work of investigative journalism. Thank you all once again, and I look forward to seeing you all at future events. Until then, keep pushing the boundaries of investigative journalism and stay committed to uncovering the stories that matter. Thank you.